Are you wondering whether you're ready to start traveling again in your chronic illness recovery journey? I have definitely lived the exact same question, and in order to be able to answer that question, I also want to share with you today a little bit of my story, which you may not know, about how I have traveled extensively with chronic illness, sometimes for the worse, and more recently, hopefully, for the better. Hi, my name's Sally. I'm a travel advisor with chronic illness, and I help people with chronic illness like me book nervous system supporting travel. I am also a psychologist, and I have done a lot of work on the nervous system as it pertains to chronic illness recovery, and you will hear me reference that extensively today because it is super relevant to the question, when am I ready to travel again with chronic illness? So to tell you a little bit of my story of travel. And first of all, let's go back to pre-illness, because I want you also to have a sense of why I am someone who knows about travel and you can trust to give you advice about travel, rather than just some random person off of the street. Travel has been really in my blood since I was born, and being fortunate to grow up in the UK, where we have much more easy access to travel to Europe and other places than perhaps people do in the US. I was very fortunate as a small child. I had a younger brother, and we would take at least one summer vacation every year, usually 2 weeks, usually in August, which is when my birthday is, so kind of a double celebration for me. And we would either go to Menorca or Portugal. Very often we would go with other family friends who also had kids about the same age, and so it was a super fun time, jumping in and out of the pool, enjoying the exotic food, etc., etc. And then when my sister came along when I was 9 and we started to do slightly different travel, we then went to France very regularly, driving down from the UK, and also to Italy and a few other places further afield. I was also fortunate to go to the US for the first time when I was 14, I think. We went to Florida, of course, for Disney World, and then I had a friend in high school whose dad was working in Canada, and she would go and stay with him in the summer vacations. And from the age of 15 onwards, I would fly by myself from London to Toronto to go and stay with her for a couple of weeks every summer. So that was really the beginning of my solo travel, which I now have continued extensively for many years beyond that. Before I moved to the US, I had also lived in Japan and in Israel, and had done various volunteering projects in school vacations in countries in Africa, and I had also traveled quite extensively in Asia and the Middle East. On moving to the US, I had far less vacation, and so for about 10 years I didn't really go anywhere new except for back to London. But then when I moved into private practice 10 years ago, obviously I had more flexibility in my schedule and started trying to do one new place a year. And since I have really gotten back into travel again in 2023, I have been to many new places. And at that point, I also added in the points and miles, which makes it much easier to travel to many places. So to talk a little bit more about traveling with chronic illness. I got sick with acute viral infection in March 2020, but because all of my family live back in England, I did continue to travel even though I was quite sick. So in August 2020, I spent a month back in England, and December 2020, I spent a month back in England. And if we think about what flying does to the body, huge amounts of inflammation, exacerbation of things like microclots and some of the other things that I deal with, like POTS and MCAS. And so not surprisingly, as part of my illness trajectory, The August 2020 trip definitely set me back functionally, and the December 2020 trip really was the beginning of my MECFS. And as a result, for most of 2021, I was really barely able to function. So I cannot stress enough that traveling too early is not helpful to your recovery, and to please pay attention to that. In particular, of note, because you know I talk a lot about wheelchair assistance at the airport. When I flew to London in August 2020, I did not need wheelchair assistance. I was still sufficiently strong enough to walk around an airport with a carry-on bag and to collect my suitcase off the carousel. When I arrived at the airport in December 2020, and this was still right in the middle of the lockdown, so almost nobody at the airport, almost no facilities open, no lounges. I think there was one store and no restaurants. It was very clear to me very quickly that even the very small walk from security to the gate, which this was back in the days when British Airways was still at Terminal 7, it really was a very short walk, and yet I was completely out of breath, racing heart rate, incredibly uncomfortable in terms of symptoms, and sat by the gate. As soon as the gate agent appeared, I then asked, could I please have early boarding, because I had not requested wheelchair assistance. Didn't know how to do that at the time. And he called me for early boarding. So I'm making my way down the jet bridge incredibly slowly with my carry-on suitcase, which was basically full of meds for 1 month in London. And then, of course, he called boarding group 1, which is all of the terribly fast-moving people in business class, who came storming down the jet bridge, practically knocked me over. And it was one of the most unpleasant and scary experiences of my lifetime. I was very unwell on the flight, incredibly high heart rate, I don't know, for those of you who record body battery, basically it hemorrhaged out to 0 and then didn't increase for several days afterwards. When I got off the plane the other end, I basically attempted to flag down somebody with a wheelchair, and she could see that I was quite sick. And obviously, as I now know, she was scheduled to pick somebody else up, but she took me as far as she could and explained to me how to request it for the return flight. And as soon as I got to my parents' apartment, I was able to go into the app and request it for the flight home. So that's why I talk about wheelchair assistance at the airport so much, because I really did learn the hard way that I needed it mid-flight. Trying to get to London, and by the end of that trip I was basically spending 90% of the day lying down on the couch. And if you remember, in those days, which the UK was still on lockdown, and so daily walks were prescribed, and my family several times tried to take me on a daily walk, and I really couldn't go very far. Had to use my dad's walking poles, and then had to be lying down afterwards for a long time. So please do be mindful of that. And when it came to August 2021, when I would normally have gone back to London for another month, I was too sick. I took the month off. I just sat on my couch for the entire month. That didn't make any difference at all. And in September 2021, very, very, very fortuitously, I came across the Safe and Sound Protocol by Stephen Porges. Now, if you want to know more about that, I do talk about it extensively on my other YouTube channel, which I will link to down below. And in that channel, I talk an awful lot about the role of the nervous system and its role in chronic illness recovery. So if you want to learn more, please do check that out. I have so many videos that you can watch on that. But basically to say that that was the beginning of me going on a huge deep dive into what is the nervous system, how does it work, how is it implicated, and obviously then, of course, thinking about how it relates to travel, because I am always somebody who is going to be doing travel. So I did see some dramatic improvements in my nervous system for the rest of that year, and I did fly home at Christmas again, and I would say while that trip was still very difficult, it was probably the first one that didn't make me worse. It definitely didn't make me better. But I was using a wheelchair from the beginning. I was using the safe and sound protocol. So there were lots of positive things that were happening to support me at that time. And I continued doing that work throughout the beginning of 2022. And that's also actually when I started working with clients with long COVID. Later that year, feeling like I was beginning to make a significant recovery, I just wanted to do a little test trip that was not back to London and to see family, to see how I went with the possibility of beginning to maybe resume travel within the US and do more vacation-like things. And so I took a 3-day weekend trip to Chicago. I had a free night to use up on the hotel. I had some points I needed to use for the flight. And it went relatively well. But important lessons to learn. I did pace myself quite considerably. I flew on the Thursday. I then worked from my hotel room on the Friday because normally I would work Thursday and not Friday. Saturday, I was actually meeting a friend of mine who is a photographer, and she had offered to take some COVID cautious photographs for me for professional purposes, which was part of the reason that I had booked that trip. So I spent the whole day taking photographs, which understandably multiple outfit changes, a lot of standing up, and I did relatively well. Got back to the hotel room, rested for the whole of the rest of the evening, got some takeout, was feeling okay, and I had a flight back to New York pretty early the next morning, which meant that I had to get up, I think, about 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And so I had taken half an Ambien to try and knock me out so that I could at least get some sleep. And then, of course, in the middle of the night, I needed to get up to use the bathroom. And in a strange hotel room, I forgot where the walls were. And I walked very fast to the bathroom through a huge concrete pillar and basically cracked a hole in my head and gave myself a huge bruise on my leg and I think also on my chest. And there was quite a lot of blood, and it being 2 in the morning, I didn't want to go to the emergency room in downtown Chicago because I knew it would be very busy and also full of less savory characters, and didn't feel safe. And also because probably people wouldn't be masking and all of those things. So I just tried to patch it up with a Band-Aid and get through the flight home with an excruciating headache and then go to urgent care when I got back to New York, and then they put steri strips on it and took it from there. So that trip is an interesting one in that I was just beginning to get a start on things, but I learned a big lesson that taking Ambien in your hotel room is not the best idea, and something to keep in mind going forward, because obviously sleep issues are something that we all contend with, and oftentimes that is a quick and relatively easy fix as long as you don't go and walk through a concrete pillar. I think I did go back to London again that summer, again relatively, easier, not easily, but easier. And then I also started to get back to thinking about things like conferences and other travel within the US. In October, they had a Polyvagal conference that Stephen Porges was running, and I was very excited to go to that. And it was very powerful and helpful for me for many reasons. But what it really highlighted, and I cannot stress this enough, is that none of us should be traveling until A, we have learnt to monitor our own nervous system, or track it, as people say, and B, we have learnt strategies to be able to regulate it in the moment as a result of tracking it and knowing what nervous system state we are in.